Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Divine Council mini series. We're already approaching lesson 9 today. We've come a long way already so far in this course. We've already covered the three major rebellions from Genesis 3 all the way through Genesis 11 that massively changed the course of the world as we know it. So we ended off with Yahweh's punishment for the post Babel event, which was obviously confusing the languages, fixing the borders, scattering the nations, and putting them under the authority of the lesser created Elohim, which ultimately were supposed to give all authority and worship to Yahweh, and they did not. We see in Psalm 82 that on the day of the Lord, at the consummation of the age, there is a great punishment that awaits them. Psalm 82 tells us that they were gods, but they will die like men because they have behaved unfavorably in the eyes of Yahweh. So we're past all that now. We looked last time at holy real estate, this idea of cosmic geography, how the territorial land guardians were actually fixed in their place, and Yahweh took that portion for himself and trained his people Israelites to know what was holy and what was not. So today, moving forward, we're approaching Genesis 12, which, as you might know, is the Abrahamic covenant. But in order to do that, we're going to need to pull back a few layers here. This is going to go well beyond the Sunday school version that I'm sure we've all heard before. When I was preparing for this, I realized that we can't just get into the nuts and bolts of the covenant because we're going to need a whole lesson here to actually explain how Yahweh presented the covenant to Abraham. So, what do I mean by that? Well, if you're ready and I'm ready, let's get into it. So, today we're going to be talking about the God Abraham knew. Okay, so we're entering a post Babel world. Genesis 11 has already been dealt with, and Genesis 10, the table of nations, resulted from this. Remember, Genesis 10 and 11 are actually backwards, and this leads us into Genesis 12, otherwise known as the Abrahamic covenant. Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, if you'll recall, was when Yahweh divided the nations, fixed the borders, and placed the nations under the allotment of the lesser Elohim. All right, we know that like the back of our hand. We got that down pat. This was the direct judgment or punishment, if you will, of the people revolting against Yahweh's mandate, which of course we know is to spread out on the earth, subdue it, and eventually we're moving towards the new Eden, right? So this was an anti-Eden mandate, if you will. But not all hope was lost. Yahweh takes a man right from the heart of the rebellion, as Yahweh does, Mesopotamia. His name was Abram at the time, not Abraham, and decides to start this human race thing all over again with him. So at times, I think we tend to gloss over this chapter, assuming that Abram knew something about Yahweh, when in fact he knew nothing about this God. Abram's background was polytheism. In fact, his family was in the business of making idols. So this is a God he knew nothing about. So Abraham was coming from a land where polytheism was alive and well. His father was in the idol making business. So Abram had to trust this God whom he didn't even know the name of. So before we can fully explain the Abrahamic covenant, we need to learn about who Abraham was exactly talking to. This is where we approach the two-godhead model. And if you've never heard of this before, it's okay. We're going to explain it. So, the two-godhead model, otherwise known as the two powers in heaven, as we'll see as we start moving along, is a Jewish concept that is intertwined into the concept of divine plurality. What it represents is there is both an invisible Yahweh and a visible Yahweh, or a Yahweh that is visible or embodied or in the likeness of a man. So, divine plurality, as we went over in great detail in lesson 1, is actually the first baby step towards thinking about the Godhead. And as we'll see, I promise you, it is consistent with Old Testament thinking. This concept of the two powers in heaven or the two Godhead model predates the idea of the Christian Trinity, which actually was enacted by early church fathers at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. So, obviously, well past the death and resurrection of Christ, this was not something that was ever in the Old Testament, although we as modern Christians and in the church, we do tend to try and read the Trinity into the Old Testament because we just don't know how to explain this concept pre-Trinity. But the early Israelites would have had no concept of the Trinity. So there's no sense in us trying to explain the New Testament, the Christian Trinity back into the Old Testament. They, however, use different language to explain how Yahweh operated. So, what I'm not suggesting here is that there are two separate living gods. We've been going through these lessons long enough that you should be aware by now that I'm not suggesting any sort of polytheism or multiple god worship, that Yahweh is the one creator. This is not about two separate living gods, but the ability of a monotheistic God having the ability to exist in more than one form simultaneously. So this is not contrary to the Christian Trinity, just in the language that an early Israelite prior to the incarnate Christ would have understood. Okay, so God as a man. Now, the early Israelites recognized Yahweh as omnipresent and embodied Yahweh, or one that was in the likeness of a man who communicated with them. So they understood that there was the glory of the Lord. There was this invisible Yahweh, an omnipresent Yahweh that they couldn't grasp, that they couldn't look at directly lest they die, right? We see that in the Old Testament. But then we have these instances where one in the likeness of a man who has the full authority of Yahweh, who speaks with the authority of Yahweh, who the Israelites recognized as being Yahweh, who came and communicated with them. So this is where we start to get that distinction of being different, but the same at the same time. So when Yahweh came and communicated with them, we get other language such as angel of the Lord, which is actually translated to either Molech Yahweh or Molech Adonai, or some sort of divine messenger. As well, eventually, we start looping in the essence or the spirit of Yahweh. Now, we are within the realm of divine plurality with this. Just as we talked about Yahweh creating members of his heavenly host, we can examine him as existing in more than one form simultaneously, right? This isn't new to any of us, or it shouldn't be anyways. So, logically, if Yahweh presented himself to people in the Old Testament in all his glory, as I said, they would not live to tell about it, right? They could not look at Yahweh directly and live. So, if you think about it, this is his way of meeting them at their level, just as Christ eventually did in the incarnation. Christ became the shepherd to the lost sheep. He came down at the people's level, at our level, and actually took us by the hand, so to speak, and showed us what to do, because this is what our God does. So, as these interfaces with Yahweh took place in the Old Testament, folks started to see that there was a distinction between the invisible and the visible Yahweh. So, how did they know the divine messenger was Yahweh, though? Well, he spoke with complete authority when instructing them, as we'll look at in a few examples here. So, this is the man that Abraham saw. So, why are we talking about this now in the midst of the Abrahamic covenant? Well, because this is where things really start to materialize literally. Yahweh literally starts to materialize within the Abrahamic covenant. So, this is why, before, like I say, before we get into the nuts and bolts of the Abrahamic covenant, we really have to look at the form and the way in which Yahweh presented this to Abraham. So, Yahweh's first real encounter with Abram was in Genesis 11, verses 31 and 32, which we'll take a look at here. Terah took Abram, his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and then Terah died in Haran. And then we're also going to, some of you may think that Genesis 12 was actually the first encounter, but this was actually the first encounter. And we see that confirmed in Acts chapter 7, verses 2 to 4, which we're going to go ahead and take a look at right now. All right. So, and Stephen said, "Brothers and fathers, hear me. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia before he lived in Haran, and said to him, 'Go out from your land and from your kindred and go into the land that I will show you.' Then he went out from the land of the Chaldeans and lived in Haran. And after his father died, God removed him from there into this land in which you are now living. Okay, so there was a little bit more of an interaction there than a lot of us we tend to miss sometimes. So, what's key here is Yahweh appeared. If you listen to what I just said, Stephen's telling us that Yahweh actually appeared. So this wasn't just some sort of audible deal that Yahweh made with Abraham. He actually appeared to him. So what does that mean that Yahweh appeared to him? It means Abram saw Yahweh in a recognizable form, which, as we'll see, was in the likeness of a man. Now, just to move into the Second Temple period literature for a bit, because you know I like to do that on this show, if we look at the Apocalypse of Abraham, which you'll find in the Apocrypha, if you have one of those, chapter 10, verse 6, it actually says, "The angel sent to me in the likeness of a man." So, what's happening in Genesis 11, verses 31 and 32, is being paralleled in the Apocalypse of Abraham here. The angel, or this some sort of divine messenger, someone that Abram immediately recognized as being Yahweh, although he initially didn't know his name was Yahweh, but someone he recognized to be the creator, to be the supreme God, to be the most high, came to him in the likeness of a man. So we'll move forward here and we're going to look at Genesis 12, verses 1 to 3, and then verses 6 to 7, and we're going to look at the language that's being used here. Okay, so starting in Genesis 12, verses 1 to 3, this is, of course, the call of Abram. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And then we go down to verse 6. It says, "Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem to the oak of Morah. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, 'To your offspring I will give this land.' So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him." Interesting. Okay, so then we're going to move down into Genesis chapter 15, which is our other appearance of Yahweh conversing with Abram here. And we're going to see a little bit more language added here. And pay attention, because the language you're going to see here, it's very similar, but it's going to start to evolve a little bit here. All right, so Genesis chapter 15, verses 1 to 6. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. "Fear not, Abram, I am your shield, your reward shall be very great." But Abram said, "O Lord God, what will you give me, for I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus?" And Abram said, "Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir." And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, "This man shall not be your heir, your very own son shall be your heir." And he brought him outside and said, "Look toward heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them." Then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. So we have a curious evolution going on here. We've gone from the visible appearance of this divine messenger, of someone that's in the likeness of a man, but now in Genesis 15, we're talking about the word of Yahweh. So Yahweh himself is now being spoken about as the word simultaneously here. It's interchangeable language, and he's actually doing something here. So now Abraham is seeing him, and he's actually bringing Abraham outside here. There's something tangible going on here. He's bringing Abraham outside. So just a side note here, this might ring a bell in your mind. This might bring you somewhere else in scripture when you hear in Genesis that the word of Yahweh brought him outside here. Does it remind you of John 1:1? Is there some sort of crossover in your mind when I say that? In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. Word, the Word meaning some sort of divine manifestation here. And then how about John chapter 1, verse 14? And the Word became flesh and made his residence, or literally that word is tabernacled. He tabernacled among us, and we saw his glory. Glory as of the one and only from the Father, full of grace and truth. Well, wait a minute. I thought we couldn't look at the Father. I thought we couldn't look at the glory of the Father and live to tell about it. So here's this evolution of the language here. We have the Word. Now, the Word is actually a person, the Word is appearing in flesh, and the Word contains all the glory of the Father. What an interesting revolution. So there's a lot packed in there, and it sounds an awful lot like John 14:9, where Jesus says, "If you have seen me, you have seen the Father." Because as we have just read from John 1:1 and John 1:14, all of the glory of the Father is packed into Jesus now. It's in the person of Jesus. No one has seen the glory of the Father, but Jesus is the glory of the Father. So, this is just one of many revelations of Christ as God and Christ as the second power in heaven, which I know we haven't talked much about the two powers in heaven yet, only that it's interchangeable with the two-godhead model, but we are going to as we get further along here. So in John chapter 8, verse 58, where Jesus says, "Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad." So all of a sudden, we have all of this packed together from Genesis and John. Genesis chapter 12 and chapter 15 provide the context. They are the backdrop for this statement that Jesus was making to the religious leaders. So it's all sort of packed up with a neat bow like that, explaining the word, explaining the glory of the Father, all wrapped up within the person of Christ. All right, let's move forward. Where's Waldo? Does anyone remember that game? Oh man, I was hooked on that as a kid, 90s kid. Anyways, I mean Yahweh. All right, we're going to take a look for your viewing pleasure here at other instances of divine plurality within the person of Yahweh, or this sort of corporeal or this anthropomorphic language explaining Yahweh. So, Genesis 22, verse 1 to 2, and 11 and 12, where God tested Abraham. So, in verse 1, this is obviously where Abraham was willing to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. In verse 1, Yahweh says, "Take your son, offer him as a burnt offering." Now, all of a sudden, we see a switch in language here. Down in verses 11 and 12, it says, "But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, 'Abraham, Abraham.' And he said, 'Here I am.' He said, 'Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me.'" So we have this curious interchange here between first person and third person language, yet this is just one being that Abraham is communicating with this whole time, and yet he's comfortable switching this language interchangeably. And the whole time, Abraham still knows exactly who he's talking to. So Abraham must have known that whoever it is who's switching this language between first and third is still Yahweh, still contains the fullness of the Godhead. So it was in this part here in Genesis 22, where God tested Abraham, where the rabbis started to notice this odd mix of first and third person speech, and they dubbed it the two powers in heaven. This was actually an accepted belief among the Jews until 100 AD, when it was declared a heresy. And I think we know why. It was likely because it lends itself too much to Christianity. In fact, it kind of helps Christians make their point, right? So two powers in heaven was the accepted concept among the Jews, that there was both an invisible and a visible God acting simultaneously within a monotheistic God. So this was fully accepted until 100 AD. So what would have happened if they continued with this? Well, obviously, then the incarnate Christ starts to make a whole lot of sense, and then they have to admit that they killed the Messiah. Oops. So now that you go now that you kind of got a hang of this first and third person interchange, I'll just point out a few other references that we won't examine too far for the sake of time, but if you want to jot them down or if you want to have a look at them for yourself, this is just a few other examples where you're going to see that first and third person mix interchangeably. Genesis 19:24 in Sodom and Gomorrah. Amos 4:11, Yahweh is using this first and third person language to describe the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and Ezekiel chapter 8 verses 2 to 6, where he is seen in Ezekiel's vision in the likeness of a man. So just a few, now that you have an idea or you're a little bit, hopefully a little bit more comfortable with how that language works, you can take a look at these references and just to get some confirmation on that. All right, moving right along here. All right, so we know that Yahweh has come visible, and now we're seeing that there is also an embodied Yahweh in the Old Testament before the incarnation of Christ. So we're going to set up camp in Genesis 18, verses 1 to 5 here, which reads, and the Lord appeared to him, obviously Abraham still, by the oaks of Mamre, as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. He lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing in front of him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth and said, O Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree while I bring a morsel of bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant. So they said, do as you have said. Curious language there. So it becomes evident then that Yahweh is one of these 3 men. And we also have elements of physicality. We have anthropomorphic language here, which is indicated by this washing of feet or partaking in a meal. Obviously, Abraham had physical men standing in front of him because he's meeting them with physical language. There's physical context to this. And in verse 25, it makes it clear that Abraham understood that one of these figures was, in fact, Yahweh, where he says, far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? And of course, this is the interface talking about Yahweh destroying the people of Sodom and Gomorrah here. So Abraham was speaking to one in the likeness of a man in this way directly as the judge here, as the one who has the authority to do this. So obviously Abraham knew that he was speaking to someone who contained the fullness of Yahweh, who was the fullness of the Godhead. So Abraham knows exactly who he's talking about here. He knows this is the one who is capable of judging all the earth. Now, this was likely understood by Abraham because he had already had previous encounters with the embodied Yahweh. So there's evidence that he likely already knew exactly who he was talking to. He knew what to expect. So in these later encounters, it doesn't seem that Abraham was at all surprised by his guess whatsoever. Just a few other examples here of similar instances. We'll look at 1 Samuel chapter 3, where verse 1 says, now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli, and the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no frequent vision. So when Yahweh starts having interface here with the boy Samuel, this is sort of the fact that there was no frequent vision in that day. It's sort of foreshadowing for us that we have Yahweh in the form of the Word, which we already learned about back in Genesis, and there's probably about to be a vision here for Samuel. So we might be expecting a vision here. Samuel hears a voice calling to him, right? But he ignores it the first few times. Finally, in verse 10, it says, then Yahweh came and stood there and called out as before. So it didn't work the first few times. So now embodied Yahweh is coming to talk with young Samuel here because he wasn't listening the first time. So we're already kind of familiar with what's going on here because we saw that evolution already with the interface with Abraham. So let's take a peek at 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 19 through 21 and see what it says here. And Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord. And the Lord appeared again at Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. So, doesn't that just sound so familiar? We have the Lord revealing himself to Samuel, and the way in which he revealed himself to Samuel was by the word, which we know is somebody in the flesh here in the likeness of man. So we get the impression that this relationship was obviously with the embodied Yahweh, and it was actually a regular thing for Samuel. Let's take a look at another example here in one more example, Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 4 to 5, where the Lord is obviously coming upon another young man, Jeremiah here. Now, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. So Jeremiah identifies this word as Yahweh himself. Then we have this tactile encounter as we move along. Something different happens here in verses 6 to 9. Then I said, ah, Lord God, behold, I do not know how to speak, for I am only a youth. But the Lord said to me, do not say, I am only a youth, for to all to whom I send you, you shall go, and whatever I command you, you shall speak. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you, declares the Lord. Then the Lord put out his hand and touched my mouth. So, what kind of figures have hands? People do. So, we have the word once again in the flesh. We have a physical, embodied presence of Yahweh, the two powers in heaven, the two-godhead model. This is pre-Trinity stuff. This is all Old Testament stuff, guys. We have that full revelation, the whole evolution of the incarnate Christ before we actually get the incarnation of Christ. How cool is that? So, before we wrap this up, I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the angel of the Lord, because we see that angel of the Lord, that divine messenger language all throughout the Old Testament as well. And I think you probably know by now where I'm going with this because I alluded to it at the beginning. So, angel of the Lord, Molech Yahweh, Molech Adonai, simply just means divine messenger. And it doesn't actually tell us whether or not, when we see the word Molech, when we see angel of the Lord, it doesn't actually tell us whether it's human or divine. We get that from the context that it's a divine messenger. So we're going to look at the burning bush example because this is just a really awesome example for us to look at. So we have Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 to 4. And let's look at this language here. Now, Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses, and he said, here I am. So this angel of the Lord appears. He speaks with authority. Then the language switches to the Lord. So Moses, by the way he responds, he inherently knows this is the Lord. He knows who's addressing him. We can see this by the way he responds. And then if we go over to Exodus chapter 23, verses 20 to 22, here we see the conquest of Canaan promised. And just listen to the language here. Behold, I send an angel before you to guard you on the way and to bring you to the place that I have prepared. Pay careful attention to him and obey his voice. Do not rebel against him, for he will not pardon your transgression, for my name is in him. But if you are careful to obey his voice and do all that I say, then I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. Okay, so big round circle around that last part of verse 21 where it says, for my name is in him. We just learned all about that name language. We learned about Hashem back in the first part of Genesis 11, 2 episodes ago. We learned all about what it means to actually have the name. The name is actually representing divine blessing, divine protection, the actual presence of the Lord, one who is the Lord. So a name is not just a name here. It was the Word himself. It was Christ himself. It was the one who has the fullness of the Godhead that led these people through the wilderness. So, this quote unquote angel, and I know sometimes in modern society or the way Hollywood has portrayed angels, we get certain images in our head when we think of that word, but we really just have to narrow it down to divine messenger because that's exactly what it is. It's not this white winged creature that Hollywood portrays. It's absolutely not that at all. And the only thing that stuff ever does is make for a bunch of misguided readers. So if we could just kind of wash that away out of our sight and just think of it as divine messenger, then we'll really start to see what the fullness of the Godhead is here. So the word angel is this angel character or this divine messenger is singled out as having the very name of God in him. So, as I said, we already talked about the power of the name a few episodes ago. It's not just a label, it's having the name of Yahweh, which means actually being Yahweh. So, the glory of God, embodied God, essence of God are all being used interchangeably here. So, let's take a look at Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 5 to 11, and we'll see a little bit more about how this name business is used. So, but you shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes to put his name, he's putting his divine presence and make his habitation there. There you shall go, and there you shall bring your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes, and the contribution that you present, your vow offerings, your freewill offerings, and the firstborn of your herd and of your flock. And there you shall eat before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice, you and your households, in all that you undertake, in which the Lord your God has blessed you. You shall not do according to all that we are doing here today, everyone doing whatever is right in his own eyes. For you have not as yet come to the rest and to the inheritance that the Lord your God is giving you. But when you go over the Jordan and live in the land that the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, and when he gives you rest from all your enemies around so that you live in safety, then to the place that the Lord your God will choose to make his name dwell there. There you shall bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes and the contribution that you present, and all your finest vow offerings that you vow to the Lord. So he's establishing the name Hashem is establishing his divine presence. It's where the Lord himself will actually dwell. This really plays on that holy real estate business that we talked about in the last episode. This is the Lord's inheritance. Everything is owned by Yahweh. He is the creator of the entire universe. He can, of course, take anything, but this is what he chooses as the Holy Land, as his own inheritance. And just like we did before, I'm going to offer you guys a few more references here if you want to take a look just on your own. As I said before, we won't go into them just for the sake of time. But if you want to jot these down or have a look at them on your own, I would suggest Judges chapter 2, verses 1 to 4, chapter 6, verses 14 to 23. This is where the Lord appears to Gideon. Genesis chapter 31, verses 10 to 13. This is where Yahweh addresses Jacob in a dream. Chapter 48, verses 14 to 16 is really cool because there's a curious interplay of words here. When Jacob or Israel blesses his sons, he uses God, God, and angel all interchangeably. Judges 13, chapter 13, verse 2, where the embodied Yahweh appears to Samson's mother. Then there's Genesis chapter 32, verses 28 and 29. And this is, of course, where Jacob wrestles with God or the angel of the Lord. And Hosea chapter 12, verse 3, which confirms the divinity of Jacob's opponent that he wrestled in Genesis 32. Okay, coming up on the end here, guys, but before we end this, I would be remiss if we did not talk about before Abraham was, I am. Such a beautiful statement. So, as I mentioned, the idea that the embodied Yahweh could be Jesus became a heresy to the Jews. Thus, the idea was abandoned in 100 AD. But this is Jewish theology. But unfortunately, if you spoke to a Jew today, they would likely have never heard of this doctrine. It came under lock and key by the sages and the Jewish wise men or the rabbis who have actually continued to debate over who the second power in heaven is. And at that time, this is where books such as Daniel was labeled as a heresy because in chapter 7, verses 9 to 13, this is where we have one like a man who is approaching the Ancient of Days. This is both a divine council scene and a scene of the visible Yahweh or Jesus approaching the Father. So this is no longer common knowledge for a modern day Jew. This is under lock and key by the rabbis who to this day continue to debate who the second power in heaven was because as far as they're concerned, it can't be Jesus. The second power in heaven, the embodied Yahweh, cannot be Jesus. It's got to be someone else. I have this book up here for you guys to take a look at here. That's absolutely wonderful, called Two Powers in Heaven by the late Alan Siegel, who is a Jewish scholar. He studied the early rabbinic views on this motif. I will warn you, it's a very dense book, but it's quite amazing to see all the layers to this doctrine. There are so many different suggestions whether Elijah was the second power in heaven, or Enoch was the second power in heaven, or Enoch, who was transliterated into the angel Metatron, was perhaps the second power in heaven. For those of you who know anything about Merkaba mysticism or the throne chariot literature, this is where you'll start to see stories about Enoch being transliterated into the angel Metatron, who a lot of rabbis think may have actually been the second power in heaven. So, if anything, this book is just very interesting to see all of the sorts of crazy doctrine that came out of this and all the different suggestions they had, because there's no possible way the second power in heaven could be Jesus, right? So, anyways, moving back to Daniel chapter 7 here. So Jesus quotes this in Matthew 26:64, right? He says, "But I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." So obviously, Jesus professing to be God to the Jewish leaders was, of course, as we know, highly offensive. They considered it blasphemy, right? In Exodus 3:14, this is where Yahweh tells Abraham what his name is. I am Yahweh, his name. This precedes the visible Yahweh revealed to Abraham. So the visible embodied Yahweh is already revealed to Abraham in the burning bush in Exodus 3:1 to 3. And then in verse 14, he tells Abraham his name. So the Jewish audience was comfortable with the idea that Abraham encountered the Messiah, so they're not denying that who Abraham encountered was the Messiah. They're comfortable with that. The Jews recognized the two powers in heaven. They just couldn't reconcile that Jesus of Nazareth, whose parents they knew, who they'd watched grow up, was the Messiah. So it was Jesus that was the problem. It wasn't the two powers in heaven that was the problem. So what's interesting about this is we've gone every which way in terms of Jewish mysticism. You know, when I first came into my knowledge with this stuff, shall I say, before I really got interested in it, I thought Judaism was one thing. And it's amazing how even just the book of Daniel or Ezekiel and little bits and pieces of different things throughout the Torah and throughout all of the Hebrew Bible have just exploded into different types of Judaism and different sects of Judaism. There's all kinds in there. So if you're a scholarly type and you like dense books, The Two Powers in Heaven is where it's at for you. If you follow my podcast, which I really hope you do, I do a weekly podcast. It gets released every Saturday morning. Episode number 29, I went into great detail in just this. What are the two powers in heaven? Again, that's episode 29. So if you're interested in learning more about that, please go and check out that podcast episode. Okay, guys, so that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you so much for joining me. I know this was dense. We went almost to the 40-minute mark, but I really appreciate you sticking with me. As I said, as we approach the Abrahamic covenant, before we get into the nuts and bolts, we first have to have this whole conversation about how Yahweh even approached Abraham to begin with. And as you can see, I didn't even scratch the surface on this yet. It is very, very dense. Anyways, thank you guys so much for sticking with me on this journey. Please like, comment, subscribe, reach out, share this with your friends. Hit my link tree to see where you can find me on social media. You can also email me at faithin20@gmail.com. And I can't wait to see you guys on the next one. Be blessed. Bye.